Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing reading from Robinson Crusoe, and today we're starting with Chapter 9, Food and Clothing. I was now in the 11th year of my residence. As I have said, my ammunition was growing low, and I set myself to study some art, to trap and snare the goats, to see whether I could not catch some of them alive. I particularly wanted a she-goat great with young. To this purpose I made snares to catch them. I believe that they were more than once taken in them, but my snares were not strong, for I had no wire, and I always found them broken and my bait devoured. At length, I resolved to try a pitfall. I dug several large pits in the earth in places where, I had observed that the goats used to feed, and over these pits I placed hurdles of my own making, with a great weight upon them. Several times I put barley and dry rice there without setting the trap, and I could easily perceive that the goats had gone in and eaten up the grain, for I could see the marks of their feet. At length I set 3 traps in one night, and when I went the next morning, I found them all standing, and yet the bait eaten and gone. This was very discouraging. However, I altered my trap, and not to trouble you with particulars, when I went one morning to see my traps, I found in one of them a large old he-goat, and in one of the others 3 kids, a male, and 2 females. I knew not what to do with the old one. He was so fierce I dared not go into the pit to him to bring him away alive, which was what I wanted. I could have killed him, but that was not my business, nor would it answer my end. Finally, I let him out, and he ran away as if he had been frightened out of his wits. I did not then know what I afterwards learned, that hunger would tame a lion. If I had let him stay there 3 or 4 days without food, and then had carried him some water to drink, and then a little grain, he would have been as tame as one of the kids, for they are very wise, tractable creatures when they are well used. However, for the present I let him go, knowing no better at that time. Then I went to the 3 kids, and taking them one by one, I tied them together with strings, and with some difficulty brought them all home. It was a good while before they would feed. However, I threw them some sweet grain, and after a time it tempted them, and they began to be tame. I now found that if I expected to supply myself with goat's flesh when I had no powder or shot left, breeding some up tame was my only way. Then perhaps I might have them about my house like a flock of sheep. But then it presently occurred to me that I must keep the tame from the wild, or else they would always run wild when they grew up. The only way to do this was to have some enclosed piece of ground well fenced, either with hedge or pale, to keep them in so effectually that those within might not break out, or those without break in. I first found a proper piece of ground wherein my goats might have grass and water. To enclose this pasture, I planted about it rows of a green, prickly scrub. I was about 3 months hedging in the first piece. Until I had it done, I tethered the 3 kids in the best part of it, and made them feed as near me as possible to make them tame. Very often I would go and carry them some barley or a handful of rice, and feed them out of my hand, so that after my enclosure was finished and I let them loose, they would follow me up and down, bleating after me for a handful of grain. This answered my end, and in about a year and a half I had a flock of about 12 goats, kids and all. In 2 years more I had 3 and 40, besides several I took and killed for my food. After that I enclosed 5 different pieces of ground to feed them in, with little pens to drive them into, to take them as I wanted them, and gates out of one piece of ground into another. But this was not all. Now I not only had goat's flesh to feed on when I pleased, but milk too, a thing which indeed in my beginning I did not so much as think of, and which, when it came into my thoughts, was really an agreeable surprise. Now I set up my dairy, and had sometimes a gallon or 2 of milk in a day. And as nature, who gives supplies of food to every creature, dictates even naturally how to make use of it, so I, that had never milked a cow, much less a goat, or seen butter or cheese made, very readily and handily, though after several trials, made both cheese and butter, and never wanted for it afterwards. It would have made anyone smile to see me and my family sit down to the table which God in his mercy had furnished me here in the wilderness. I was like a king dining alone, attended only by my servants. Paul, as if he had been my favorite, was the only person permitted to talk to me. My dog, which was now grown old and crazy, and found no species to multiply his kind upon, sat always at my right hand. The 2 cats sat one on one side of the table and one on the other, expecting now and then a bit from my hand as a mark of special favor. These were not the two cats which I brought on shore at first, for they were both of them dead and had been buried near my habitation by my own hands. One of them had multiplied by I know not what kind of creature, and these were two which I kept tame. The rest ran wild into the woods and became indeed troublesome to me at last. They would often come into my house and plunder me too, till at last I was obliged to shoot them. After I had killed a great many, they stopped molesting me. In this plentiful manner I lived. Neither could I be said to want anything but society, and of that, some time after this, I came near having too much. I was somewhat impatient, as I have observed, to have the use of my boat, though I was very loath to run any more risk. Therefore, sometimes I tried to contrive ways to get her about the island, and at other times I was contented enough without her. But I had a strange longing in my mind to go down to the point of the island, where, as I have said in my last ramble, I went up the hill to see how the shore lay and how the current set, that I might see what I had to do. This inclination increased every day, and at length I resolved to travel thither by land, and following the edge of the shore, I did so. Had anyone in England met such a man as I was, it must either have frightened them or raised a great deal of laughter. As I frequently stood still to look at myself, I could not but smile at the notion of my traveling through Yorkshire with such an equipage and in such a dress. I had a great high shapeless cap, made of goat skin, with a flap hanging down behind as well to keep the sun from me, as to shoot the rain off from running into my neck. Nothing is so hurtful in these climates as the rain upon the flesh under the clothes. I had a short jacket of goat skin, the skirts coming down to about the middle of my thighs, and a pair of open-kneed breeches of the same. The breeches were made of the skin of an old he-goat, whose hair hung down such a length on either side that, like pantaloons, it reached to the middle of my legs. Stockings and shoes I had none, but I made me a pair of something, I scarce know what to call them, like buskins, to flap over my legs and lace on either side like spatterdashes, but of a most barbarous shape, as indeed were all the rest of my clothes. I had on a broad belt of dried goat's skin, which I drew together with two thongs of the same instead of buckles. In a kind of frog on either side of this, instead of sword and dagger, hung a little saw and a hatchet, one on one side, one on the other. I had another belt not so broad, and fastened in the same manner, which hung over my shoulder, and at the end of it under my left arm hung two pouches, both made of goat's skin too. In one of these hung my powder, in the other my shot. At my back I carried my basket, on my shoulder my gun, and over my head a great clumsy, ugly goat-skin umbrella, which after all was the most necessary thing I had about me next to my gun. As for my face, the color of it was really not so mulatto-like as one might expect from a man not at all careful of it, and living within 9 or 10 degrees of the equinox. My beard I had once allowed to grow till it was about 1/4 of a yard long, but as I had both scissors and razors sufficient, I had cut it pretty short, except what grew on my upper lip, which I had trimmed into a large pair of Mahometan whiskers, such as I had seen worn by some Turks whom I saw at Sally. Of these mustachios or whiskers, I will not say they were long enough to hang my hat upon them, but they were of length and shape monstrous enough, and such as in England would have passed for frightful. But all this is by the by, for I had so few to observe my figure that it was no matter of consequence, so I will say no more about it. I was out 5 or 6 days on my new journey. I traveled first along the seashore directly to the place where I first brought my boat to an anchor to get up upon the rocks, and having no boat now to take care of, I went over the land a nearer way to the same height that I was upon before. When I looked out to the point of the rock which I had been obliged to double with my boat, as I said above, I was surprised to see the sea all smooth and quiet. There was no rippling, no motion, no current, any more there than in other places. I was at a strange loss to understand this, and resolved to spend some time in observing it to see if the sets of the tide had occasioned it. As I considered, I was presently convinced that the tide of ebb setting from the west, and joining with the current of waters from some great river on the shore, must be the occasion of this current. Therefore, according as the wind blew more forcibly from the west or from the north, this current came nearer or went farther from the shore. I waited thereabouts till evening, and went up to the rock again. The tide was then at the ebb, and I plainly saw the current again as before, only that it ran farther off, being nearly 1/2 a league from the shore. When I had gone by there, the current had run close to the shore and hurried me and my canoe along with it, which at another time it would not have done. This observation convinced me that I had nothing to do but to observe the ebbing and the flowing of the tide, and I might very easily bring my boat about the island again. You are to understand that now I had, as I may call it, 2 plantations in the island. One was my little fortification or tent with the wall about it under the rock, with a cave behind me, which by this time I had enlarged into several apartments or caves, one within another. One of these, which was the driest and largest and had a door beyond where my wall joined to the rock, was all filled up with large earthen pots of which I had given an account, and with 14 or 15 great baskets which would hold 5 or 6 bushels each. There I laid up my stores of provision, especially my grain, some cut off short from the straw and some rubbed out with my hands. As for my wall, made as before with long stakes or piles, those piles grew all like trees, and were by this time grown so big and spread so very much that there was not the least appearance to anyone's view of any habitation behind them. Near this dwelling of mine, but a little farther within the land and upon lower ground, lay the 2 pieces of ground which I kept duly cultivated and sowed, and which duly yielded me their harvest of grain in its season. Whenever I had occasion for more grain, I had more land adjoining as fit as that. Besides this, I had my country seat, and I had now a tolerable plantation there also. First, I had my little bower, as I called it, which I kept in repair. I kept the hedge which circled it and constantly fitted up to its usual height, the ladder standing always in the inside. The trees, which at first were no more than my stakes, but were now grown very firm and tall, I kept always so cut that they might spread and grow thick and wild and make them more agreeable shade, which they did effectually to my mind. In the middle of this I had my tent always standing. It was a piece of sail spread over poles set up for that purpose, and never wanted any repair or renewing. Under this I had made a couch with the skins of the creatures I had killed, and with other soft things, and a blanket laid on them, such as belonged to our sea bedding, which I had saved, and a great watch coat to cover me. Here, whenever I had occasion to be absent from my chief seat, I took up my country habitation. Adjoining to this, I had my enclosures for my goats. I had taken an inconceivable deal of pains to fence and enclose this ground, and I was so uneasy to see it kept entire lest the goats should break through, that I never stopped till with infinite labor I had stuck the outside of the hedge so full of small stakes so near to one another that it was rather a pale than a hedge. There was scarcely room to put a hand through between them when those stakes grew, as they all did in the next rainy season, and they made the enclosure stronger than any wall. This will testify for me that I was not idle, and that I spared no pains to bring to pass whatever appeared necessary for my comfortable support. I considered that the keeping up of a breed of tame creatures would be a living magazine of flesh, milk, butter, and cheese for me, as long as I lived in the place, as if it were to be 40 years. Keeping them in my reach depended entirely upon my perfecting my enclosures to such a degree that I might be sure of keeping them together. By this method, indeed, I succeeded so well that when these little stakes began to grow, I found that I had planted them so very thick that I was forced to pull some of them up again. In this place also I had my grapes growing, which I principally depended on for my winter store of raisins, and which I never failed to preserve very carefully as the best and most agreeable dainty of my whole diet. Indeed, they were not only agreeable, but wholesome, nourishing, and refreshing to the last degree. As this was also about halfway between my other habitation and the place where I had laid up my boat, I generally stayed and lay here in my way thither, for I used frequently to visit my boat, and I kept all things about her in very good order. Sometimes I went out in her to divert myself, but no more hazardous voyages would I go, nor scarce ever above a stone's cast or 2 from the shore. I was so apprehensive of being hurried out of my knowledge again by the currents, or winds, or any other accident. Chapter 10. The Savages. Now I come to a new scene of my life. It happened one day about noon as I went toward my boat that I was exceedingly surprised to see the print of a man's naked foot on the shore, which was very plain to be seen in the sand. I stood like one thunderstruck, or as if I had seen an apparition. I listened. I looked round me. I could hear nothing, see nothing. I went up to a rising ground to look farther. I went up the shore and down the shore, but it was all one. I could see no other impression but that one. I went to it again to see if there were any more, and to observe if it might not be my fancy, but there was no room for that, for there was exactly the very print of a foot, toes, heel, and every part of a foot. How it came thither I knew not, nor could in the least imagine. I came home to my fortification, terrified to the last degree, looking behind me at every 2 or 3 steps, mistaking every bush and tree, and fancying every stump at a distance to be a man. When I came to my castle, for so I think I called it ever after this, I fled into it like one pursued. Whether I went over by the ladder at first contrived, or went in at the hole in the rock which I called a door, I cannot remember. No, nor could I remember my next morning. I had no sleep that night. The farther I was from the occasion of my fright, the greater my apprehensions were, which is something contrary to the nature of such things, and especially to the usual practice of all creatures in fear. But I was so filled with my own frightful ideas of the thing that I formed nothing but dismal imaginations to myself, even though I was now a great way from it. At last I concluded that it must be some of the savages of the mainland who had wandered out to sea in their canoes, and either driven by the currents or by contrary winds, had made the island and had been on shore, but were going away again to sea, being as loath, perhaps, to stay in this desolate island as I would have been to have had them. For a long time I lived in great fear, and then one day it came into my thoughts that all this might be a mere chimera of my own, and that this foot might be the print of my own foot when I came on shore from my boat. This cheered me up a little too, and I began to persuade myself that it was all a delusion. I considered that I could by no means tell for certain where I had trod and where I had not. Now I began to take courage and to peep abroad again, for I had not stirred out of my castle for 3 days and nights, so that I began to starve for provision. I had little or nothing within doors but some barley cakes and water. Then I knew that my goats wanted to be milked too, which usually was my evening diversion. Heartening myself, therefore, with the belief that this was nothing but the print of one of my own feet, and so I might be truly said to start at my own shadow, I began to go abroad again and went to my country house to milk my flock. To see with what fear I went forward, how often I looked behind me, how I was ready every now and then to lay down my basket and run for my life, would have made anyone think that I was haunted with an evil conscience, or that I had been lately most terribly frightened, and so indeed I had. However, as I went down thus 2 or 3 days and saw nothing, I began to be a little bolder, and to think that there was really nothing in it but my own imagination. I could not persuade myself fully of this, however, till I should go down to shore again and measure the print by my own foot. But when I came to the place first, it appeared evident to me that when I laid up my boat, I could not possibly be on shore anywhere thereabouts. Secondly, when I came to measure the mark with my own foot, I found my foot not so large by a great deal. Both these things filled my head with new imaginations. Tortured with fear of what visiting savages might do to me, I began sorely to repent that I had dug my cave so large as to bring a door through, beyond where my fortification joined to the rock. Upon maturely considering this, therefore, I resolved to draw a second fortification, in the manner of a semicircle, at a distance from my wall, just where I planted a double row of trees about 12 years before, of which I made mention. These trees had been planted so thick that when a few piles were driven between them, my wall was finished. I had now a double wall, and my outer wall was thickened with pieces of timber, old cables, and everything I could think of to make it strong. I had in it 7 holes big enough for me to put my arm through. In the inside of this I thickened my wall to about 10 feet thick, continually bringing earth out of my cave and laying it at the foot of the wall and walking upon it. Through the 7 holes I contrived to plant muskets, which I had brought on shore out of the ship. I planted them like cannon and fitted them into frames that held them like a carriage, so that I could fire all the 7 guns in 2 minutes' time. This wall I was many a weary month in finishing, and I never thought myself safe till it was done. When this was done, I stuck all the ground outside my wall, for a great way every way, full of stakes or sticks of the osier-like wood, which I found so ready to grow. I believe I must have set in nearly 20,000 of them, leaving a pretty large space between them and my wall, so that I might have room to see the enemy, and they might have no shelter from the young trees if they attempted to approach my outer wall. Thus, in 2 years' time, I had a thick grove, and in 5 or 6 years' time, I had a wood before my dwelling grown so monstrous thick and strong that it was indeed perfectly impassable. No man would ever have imagined that there was anything beyond it, much less a dwelling. I myself proposed to go in and out, for I left no avenue, by setting 2 ladders, one to a part of the rock which was low and broken in, and the other on the ledge thus formed. When the 2 ladders were taken down, no man living could come down to me without hurting himself, and if he did come down, he would still be on the outside of my outer wall. Thus I took all the measures human prudence could suggest for my own preservation. It will be seen later on that they were not altogether without just reason, for though I foresaw nothing at that time more than my mere fear suggested. While I was doing this, I was not altogether careless of my other affairs. I was particularly careful of my little herd of goats. They were not only a present supply to me upon every occasion, and began to be sufficient for me without the expense of powder and shot, but they also did away with the fatigue of my hunting after the wild ones. I was loath to lose the advantage of them, and to have them all to raise over again. Accordingly, I spent some time in finding out the most retired part of the island. I finally selected 3 acres of choice pasture in the woods. This I now proceeded to fence and to make as firmly secure as my first meadow. Here, then, I placed a part of my young goats very carefully concealed among the trees. All this labor I was at the expense of purely from my apprehensions on the account of the print of a man's foot which I had seen. As yet I had not seen any human creature come near the island, and I had now lived 2 years under these uneasinesses, which indeed made my life much less comfortable than it was before, as may well be imagined by any who know what it is to live in the constant fear of man. One day on a trip to the end of the island, where I had never been before, I was presently convinced that seeing the print of a man's foot was not such a strange thing in the island as I imagined. I began to see that it was due to a special providence that I was cast upon the side of the island where the savages never came. If I had not been, I should easily have known that nothing was more frequent than for the canoes from the mainland, when they happened to be a little too far out at sea, to shoot over to that side of the island for harbor. I should have known, too, that as they often met and fought in their canoes, the victors, having taken any prisoners, would bring them over to this shore, where, according to their dreadful customs, being all cannibals, they would kill and eat them. More of this hereafter. When I had come down the hill to the shore, which was, as I said above, the southwest point of the island, I was perfectly confounded and amazed, nor is it possible for me to express the horror of my mind at seeing the shore spread with skulls, hands, feet, and other bones of human bodies. Particularly, I observed a place where there had been a fire made, and a circle dug in the earth like a cockpit, where I supposed that the savage wretches had sat down to their inhuman feastings upon the bodies of their fellow creatures. I turned away my face from the horrid spectacle. My stomach grew sick, and I was just at the point of fainting. I could not bear to stay in the place a moment, so I hurried up the hill again with all the speed I could, and walked on toward my own habitation. When I came a little out of that part of the island, I stood still a while, amazed. Then, recovering myself, I looked up with the utmost affection of my soul, and with a flood of tears in my eyes, I gave thanks to God, who had cast my first lot in a part of the world where I was distinguished from such dreadful creatures as these. In this frame of thankfulness, I went home to my castle, and began to be much easier now as to the safety of my circumstances than ever I was before. I observed that these wretches never came to this island in search of what they could get. No doubt they had often been up in the covered woody part of it without finding anything to their purpose. I knew that I had been here now almost 18 years, and had never seen the least footsteps of a human creature there before. I might be here 18 years more, as entirely concealed as I was now, if I did not discover myself to them. Yet I entertained such an abhorrence of the savage wretches that I have been speaking of, and of the wretched, inhuman custom of their devouring, eating one another up, that I continued pensive and sad, and kept close within my own circle for almost 2 years after this. When I say my own circle, I mean by it my 3 plantations, my castle, my country seat, which I called my bower, and my enclosure in the woods. I did not look after this for any other use than as an enclosure for my goats, for the aversion which nature gave me for these hellish wretches was such that I was as fearful of seeing them as of seeing the devil himself. Time, however, and the satisfaction I had that I was in no danger of being discovered by these people began to wear off my uneasiness about them. I began to live in just the same composed manner as before, only with this difference, that I used more caution and kept my eyes more about me than I did before, lest I should happen to be seen by any of them. Particularly, I was more cautious of firing my gun, lest any of them being on the island should happen to hear it. However, I was never without my gun, the 2 pistols, and also the old cutlass I had brought from the boat. Night and day I could think of nothing but how I might destroy some of these monsters in their cruel, bloody entertainment, and if possible save the victim that they should bring thither to destroy. It would take up a larger volume than this whole work is intended to be, to set down all the contrivances I hatched, or rather brooded upon in my thoughts, for destroying these creatures, or at least frightening them, so as to prevent their coming hither any more. All this was fruitless, however. Nothing could take effect unless I was to be there to do it myself, and what could one man do among them, when perhaps there might be 20 or 30 of them together with their darts or their bows and arrows, with which they could shoot as true to a mark as I could with my gun? Sometimes I planned to dig a hole under the place where they made their fire, and put in 5 or 6 pounds of gunpowder, which, when they kindled their fire, would consequently take fire and blow up all that was near it. There were 2 arguments against this, however. In the first place, I should be loath to waste so much powder upon them, my store being now within the quantity of a barrel. In the second place, I could not be sure of its going off at any certain time when it might surprise them. So I laid aside this plan and began to think how I could place myself in ambush with my 3 guns and surprise them in that way. I'm going to stop there and start next time, right there where we finished. And I will start next time with the second half of this chapter. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.